And that's it. The Overwatch League 2021 season is complete. A champion has been crowned, and the final Overwatch 1 map has been played in the Overwatch League. This was an amazing season, and the final tournament did not disappoint. So let's get started. Hey guys, how's it going? My name is Noise, and welcome to the Overwatch League Weekly Recap. In this video, we'll be going over the final playoff tournament of the 2021 season, partially to talk about how all the teams did, but mostly to see how my predictions matched up to reality. As such, there is a full spoiler warning for these games, so if you haven't seen them, not only are you a couple of months behind, you may also want to wait for this video. Seriously though, a spoiler warning is probably not really needed at this point, but I'm going to do it anyways. So before we get into the video, let's talk a little bit about what's been taking so long to finish this series. Long story short, I got burnt out, both of rewatching the games to do my little analysis and whatnot, and working on the scripts and recording it and editing it and all that. It's really taken a lot of motivation just to make this, and with news of the next season on the horizon, we need to finish this season and the last 7 videos I want to make. That's right, after this we'll be heading back to week 13 and 14, plus the Countdown Cup, and one last video I want to make to kind of complete the Overwatch Weekly Recap series. I'm going to try to get things done a lot quicker from here on out, mostly because the end is in sight. So without further ado, let's get started. Alright, so starting off, I do want to note that I will not be going in the order of the games as they were played, as that was based on time zone, so it was better for everyone playing and watching, but I'm going to be going in the order of the bracket from top to bottom. That means for the first round of matches, we'll begin with the San Francisco Shock taking on the Shanghai Dragons. So again, despite this being the third match played, we're going to talk about it first. And what a match it was. So I predicted that this would be a 3-1 in favor of the Shanghai Dragons, but the Shock were outclassed. Honestly, Shanghai came out and made a point to the rest of the league, and ended up winning 3-0. We start with control, and this was the only time that the Shock looked like they had control for most of the match. Ilios was the map, and to counter Shanghai's ball dive style comps, Shock played a lot of the zombie comp. If you're not familiar with the zombie comp, basically it is a Winston Diva tank line, Moria Lucio supports, and a Reaper Sombra DPS. The whole idea of it is that it is a very brawly comp that takes up space while being highly mobile and extremely difficult to kill. And it actually did decent against the super strong ball dive with the Tracer Sombra that Shanghai has been running. Nero looked especially good playing the Reaper, as pretty much every time Shock were able to get onto the point, they were able to control that space just with the threat of the Reaper. But ultimately, Lip Sombra did way too much work. Shanghai did have a moment of mortality, especially Izayaki playing the Zen, who had a tendency to use Transcendence in lost fights and waste that ult. But while it was close, Shanghai managed to win the map. The next map was Hanamura, and this was not even close. Shock's attack was again the zombie comp, but this time with Fleta playing the Pharah and Lip on the Ashe for the Dragons in an Orisa comp, the Shock just kinda did nothing. Like, Shock spent the entire time trying to move into positions, but never really accomplished anything except dying and going back to spawn. It was really bad, and the Shock did not even get a tick, allowing Shanghai to quickly win that map. The final map, King's Row, was a little closer, the Shock wanting to run a Rhine comp and Shanghai still on the ball. But Shock didn't have much of a defense until the end of B, though they were able to use ults to hold into overtime, but Shanghai were able to get Lip's EMP to get the cart through and finish the map in OT. On Shock's attack, again the Shock wanted to play the Rhine style, and it worked, getting them through A and B fairly easily. A little defense from the Dragons at the end of B, but it did force Shanghai to swap to a double shield comp, and that was unfortunate for the Shock. Fleta's Echo did so much work during C, including MTDing Super with a duplicated Rhine, and despite an amazing 5k TP'd Diva Bomb from Choyobin, the Shock just could not finish the map, and Shanghai won. Now, this means that the Dragons move on, and the Shock move to the losers bracket. The Dragons looked good at this point, willing to change to other comfortable comps from the ball style that they've looked so good on, which is a good sign for a top team to be able to deal with the best the opposition can muster. As for the Shock, despite it not working on Hanamura, the zombie comp looked good for them to deal with the ball comp, but they have to respect the other team's player, as Fleta got away with so much on the Pharah and Echo, mostly because nobody other than Choyobin on the Diva could really do anything about it. When you're going up against the top teams, you can't just ignore players if you want to win. You need to pressure them, make them play uncomfortable, or swap if you want to beat the best of the league. Next up, the Philadelphia Fusion played the Los Angeles Gladiators. This match was full of dive comps, and while I predicted that the Gladiators would 3-0 the Fusion, Philadelphia proved me wrong by taking a map, making the final score 3-1 to the Gladiators. Beginning on Ilios for control, the Gladiators were the only ones in control pretty much the entire time, and although Fusion started to look better on the second point with Hapa and Carpe doing some work, the Gladiators easily took the first map. Next up, the Fusion took us to Anubis, where again lots of dive was played, and for pretty much the only time this series, Philadelphia looked in control. Gladiators had a pretty easy time getting A with a nice hack onto Shockwave's Echo from Birdring, but then Gladiators completely faltered. The Gladiators kept trying to get into B, but would almost always lose one or two members and just not be able to keep the fight going to get any progress on the point. Fusion were just too good at the counter dive and repelling the attacks, and eventually Gladiators were fully held on B. For Fusion's attack, nice ult usage got Philadelphia progress on A, and even better drew out a bunch of ults from a failed recontest from the Gladiators, and Fusions were able to snowball to get their one map win of the series. The next two maps were not close, as both teams switched over to more double shield styles for King Row and Havana, and the Gladiators liked playing the Zen Bat backline with Kevster on the Tracer, while Fusion had to have Funny Astro on the Brig because anytime he tried to play anything else, whether it be Zen or anything for that matter, Kevster just popped off and demolished the Fusion supports. The big highlight of the last two maps for the Fusions was a really good spawn hold on Havana, playing the Rhine Rush comp when Gladiators really couldn't match that, as they had both Shu and Skewed in on their supports, and neither of them are really comfortable in the Lucio. So it took the Gladiators half the time bank just to start pushing the cart, but outside of that, the Fusion had basically no defense and were completely panic-stricken by the end of Havana. Gladiators didn't really have much of a struggle. Looking at the good for both of these teams, the DPS for the Gladiators looked unstoppable, and the Glads like playing an uncommon double shield comp, which really works well. As for the Fusion, they have issues waiting for the perfect moment to ult, or they just throw their ult away, rarely anything in between, but the measured aggression is there, which is good, and they can always rely on Carpe to carry. But the Gladiators move on, and the Fusion fall. In our third game, the Washington Justice went up against the Dallas Fuel. Now, for this game, a lot of people believe Washington to be the favorite, mostly due to the poor performance of the Fuel during the Countdown Cup. And I'll be honest, the Justice had looked a lot better at the end of the season, so I predicted a close game. But I knew Dallas was the better team, so my prediction of a 3-2 in favor of the Fuel was decent, but Dallas had an easier time of the Justice and won 3-1. Starting off, Control on Lijiang was a really close map, both sides playing a lot of the Rhine Rush style comps, and despite Mag on Washington being one of the best Rhines statistically in the league, Fearless did a lot of work with some great shatters, and when Sparkle on Dallas swapped to the Doomfist, the Justice were in trouble. But ultimately, a combination of shutting Fearless and Sparkle down and dragging the fights on so that Decay on the Symmetra could charge up gave Justice the edge. Seriously, Decay on the Sim was destroying Dallas, and is a huge part of why the Justice were able to take that first map. But from there, it just went downhill for the Justice. Next on Volskaya, the Justice playing the so-called zombie comp were able to get some good hacks from Assassin onto the tank line of Dallas and take the point very quickly. Dallas had started on a ball dive comp that slowly over the course of B switched to a more classic Winston dive, and just good ults, nice picks, and good use of abilities from Dallas allowed the Fuel to put up a fantastic defense. Seriously, Fielder on both the Zen and Ana did so much work, always having Transcendence for Assassin's EMPs and getting great Bionades while playing the Ana. The Justice were fully held on B, and after another Rhine Rush mirror, mostly anyway as Decay played the McCree against Sparkle's Sim, Dallas came through and won Volskaya. Next, the Justice took us to King's Row, where Dallas wanted to play the double bubble comp with the Hanzo Doom. And again, Sparkle on the Doom did too much work. An early pick on Assassin on the Mei, and Dallas were able to get most of A without any trouble. And then after a bit of delay from Justice, they started dominating King's Row. And I'm not exaggerating, Dallas played the entire point B in Washington spawn. Hanbin on the Zarya grabbed Washington in their spawn. The only time the Justice touched the cart during B was at the very end, and it was just Fury on the Diva, and I don't even think he made it to the cart in time. Justice had very little defense and eventually won a team fight, but Dallas still capped with 3 minutes left. Justice offense was a completely different story, again running the Rhine Rush with a McCree against Fuel's ball dive, and Dallas made the Justice fight for every inch of progress. Assassin was doing really well in the Mei, and once Sparkle switched to the Doom, and with Doha and the Sombra, Justice were just constantly harassed and beaten down. Washington did manage to get halfway through C, but another map to Dallas. And the final map, the map of no defense past A, we went to Havana, and again Justice wanted to play Decay on the McCree. Now, Havana is typically the place every team likes to spawn camp, and Justice did it well. Dallas struggled to and started on a double bubble comp before finally switching to more of a Rhine comp, and finally Dallas were able to get out of spawn and move the cart. Justice had no defense after A, and Dallas completed with a minute remaining. On Washington's attack, Dallas were not able to do much of a spawn camp, but were able to hold Washington before the end of A into overtime, and again Dallas presented no defense past A. And Washington were able to finally complete Havana, but with less time. In the time bank, the Justice, with only a minute, did not win a team fight, but were able to get a pick onto Fielder's Baptiste, which forced Dallas back long enough to allow Washington to gain some progress. But on the Fuel's attack, the worst thing imaginable happened. After Dallas picked both tanks, Justice were forced back, and once the tanks got back, Washington was getting into position when the map ended. Washington never touched the point. They C9'd and lost. So with that, the Fuel moved on and the Justice dropped down to the losers bracket. All in all, the Fuel looked much more comfortable on the ball comps and the more divey styles in general than they have in the past, and still have that clutch potential. But for the Justice, while not all is bad, as Assassin is looking much better than I've given him credit for, Decay is just trying to play too much McCree in the Rhine comps and is getting punished. When Decay is quiet, the Justice look a bit non-existent. And finally, for the first day of the tournament, the Atlanta Reign fought against the Chungdu Hunters. So to start, let's address the Pelican issue. Now, I had stated this during my prediction video for the playoffs, but Pelican of the Atlanta Reign, who at the time was recovering from surgery of a collapsed lung, was not going to be able to go to Hawaii. And I assumed incorrectly that he'd be playing from Atlanta on very high ping and might not actually get to play the entire time, which would be bad for Atlanta as he's arguably the best player on the team. I mean, he did get Rookie of the Year after all. But instead, Pelican was able to get to LA and played from there with some ping, and not just the high ping from Atlanta, and just considerably less ping. So my prediction did not account for Pelican playing the entire time, and that's why I originally predicted that Atlanta would lose 3-1 to the Hunters. But with Pelican, it was a much closer game. The Hunters still winning, and it went to 5 with a 3-2 scoreline. Starting off, Control went to Nepal, and Atlanta played exclusively Rhine Rush with Kyle McCree against the ball dive of Chungdu, with Jinmu playing the Pharah. Now, Jinmu's Pharah is very good, but so is Kai, and this map was so back and forth, nearly going to 99-99 in the first point. But the second point was much more in favor of Atlanta, and they took this map. The next map, Anubis, Atlanta switched things up. Chungdu did as well, but Atlanta went for the zombie comp and took A easily, but Chungdu with Jinmu on the Sombra and Leave on the Echo held B for a bit before Pelican canceled Jinmu's EMP with an EMP of his own and allowed Atlanta to cap B with time. But for Chengdu's attack, Atlanta held too close and lost A very quickly, then held B for a good while before diving too deep again, and C9 allowing Chengdu to cap with 3 more seconds than Atlanta. So again, in the time bank for both sides, no defense on A, Chengdu has a better B defense and end up taking the point, tying the match. Moving on to King's Row, Chengdu's attack gets the pick needed to get the point, but only managed to get 2 ticks before Atlanta comes back in and push the Hunters off. Jinmu on the Pharah is again doing work for Chengdu, giving them A with a nano from far away. This map is so back and forth to the extent that Chengdu have to cap B in overtime, but after switching comps from a ball dive to an Arisa comp, Chengdu is able to complete the map in OT. On the other hand, Chengdu had a great A defense, but that was about it. Atlanta had very little issue getting through the rest of King's Row and capped C with nearly 3 minutes, leading to a decently quick tick on A to win the map. Chengdu then took us to Dorado, where Atlanta played the ball comp on attack. It is nice to see Atlanta playing such varied comps, as this is something they've struggled with all season. This match in general was really close up to this point, but up until the end of B, Chengdu looked completely out of sorts, but started looking better once Nisha got onto the brig. And that's when things went downhill for Atlanta. Chengdu held the rain early on C, and on attack, Gator tries to force the Ryan, and it just doesn't work like it did on Nepal. Apart from a bit of spawn camp that took some time off the clock, both at the beginning of the map and the beginning of B, Atlanta never really had much of a defense, and Chengdu won this map, leading to the map 5 at Oasis, which again, the Rhine Rush stopped working for Atlanta, and Chengdu were able to take this map and the win with relative ease. This match was very close at time. Chungdu looked strong when Leave and Jinmu are comfortable, but Jinmu's a bit too inconsistent, and at this point, Leave is not going to be enough for the Hunters to beat some of the other top teams. That being said, the supports for Chungdu have looked a lot better in this match than they have before, especially Farway, who looked fantastic on both the Xin and the Ana. As for Atlanta, it's really good to see them playing a variety of comps, but they need to be more willing to swap mid-game and can't just rely on the DPS to carry. Pelican, while great, does have some minor issues with EMPs and coordinating with the team, but like I said, it's a minor issue, so it's not that big of a deal. Both of these teams look like they can be either very strong or very weak going forward. And with that, the first 4 teams moved on, and the other 4 teams faced the prospect of early elimination. But hey, my predictions were decent, getting the 4 winning teams correct, even if I got every scoreline wrong. But things are just going to go downhill from here for my predictions. Down to the losers bracket we go, and for the first round we have the San Francisco Shock going up against the Philadelphia Fusion, and the Washington Justice taking on the Atlanta Reign, as all 4 of these teams fight to stay in the tournament. Starting from the top, the San Francisco Shock went up against the Philadelphia Fusion. Now, I didn't have high hopes for this match. Nope, I didn't think too highly of Philly when going through my predictions, and I didn't think they would be able to get a single map this tournament. Let's be honest, Philly was just the best of the worst out of the East Division, a division that was not nearly as high level as I thought it would be at the start of the season, apart from of course Shanghai and Chungdu, as they were both good. Now, I felt like Philly would be an easy match for the Shock leading into the next round, but I was wrong. My prediction of a 3-0 to the Shock went the distance to 5, and the Shock were barely able to defeat Philly 3-2. Starting off on Nepal for control, Fusion played pretty much every style, from the ball dive to the hybrid ball Sigma comp to a double shield style Rhine Sigma, while the Shock liked playing Rhine Rush with a little bit of double shield. In the first point, Shock pretty much just stood around on the point. Fusion were absolutely absent from the first round of Nepal, and Shockwave on the Sombra looked, well, honestly terrible. Shockwave was so slow at building EMP, and when he finally did get it, the EMP was good, but it just was too slow. Fusion looked better on the second point with Shockwave on a more comfortable pick in the Ashe, and Fusion took us to the third point, which was incredibly close with the nearly mirrored Rhine Rush style, Fusion choosing to play the Sigma over the Diva, but it almost worked. There were signs in this map of a communication problem for Fusion, as Carpe on the Mei blocked Mono Shatter with the wall, which might have helped, but I think Fusion won that fight regardless. It's just sad when your Mei blocks your Shatter. Still, Shock were able to take the map, and Philly took us to Voskaya. This map was completely in control of Philly. Both teams playing mostly a dive style, with Fusion exclusively playing the ball dive. Fusion took A without any ults, allowing them to snowball on B with plenty of time remaining, while Shock struggled against Fusion's defense and barely capping A with any time. Carpe did so much on this map and carried the Fusion, and while Shock did complete B, it was an OT. With nearly 4.5 minutes to get a tick on A, Fusion had no trouble winning that map. Shock then took us to King's Row, and this was a close map. Fusion had some weird team comps for this map, playing a lot of double bubble on attack and having EQO on the Genji. I hate that pick. Like, I know that EQO is more than capable on Genji, historically one of the better Genjis in the league, but the thing is, Genji isn't good. Unless you're one of the best Genjis in the world, like say Sparkle from Dallas or even Jinmu from Chungdu, don't play Genji. That being said, Fusion had to fight every inch for progress and eventually did get the complete, but in OT. Luckily, Shock had similar troubles. Well, eventually once Fusion started getting a defense near the end of the map on C. Shock didn't really have any trouble getting the cart through B, but once we got to the point C, Fusion's defense started up, mostly due to Carpe popping off. Shock were able to complete, but also in OT. And for the time being, Fusion tried running the Genji, got nothing really done in the minute, and Shock came back, got some good picks, and managed to take the map. On to the next one, and we went to Route 66. And back we go the other way. The series was really back and forth, and if the team picked the map, they probably won. For Fusion's attack, the Shock never really had a defense, but were annoying enough to delay the Fusion and push them off the cart just to kind of slow down the progress. Like, Shock never really got a clean team fight win, but would occasionally get enough picks to push Fusion back briefly, and it just took Philly forever to push the cart through the map. They did complete though, and with time remaining. On the other side, Fusion didn't have much of a defense through A, but starting on B, Philly began getting teamfight wins, which caused Shock to switch comps. Shock were also constantly slowed by pushing the cart, but Philly was actually winning out teamfights and eventually held the Shock to take the map. This map was interesting though, as it showed that the Shock had comp issues if what they wanted to play wasn't working out. Shock also showed in this map that they really value support ults like Lucio's Sound Barrier, and would try to build comps around that ult if they had it or were close to it. But moving on to the last map, we went to Ilios, and this one was not particularly close. Shock played the zombie comp, and Fusion's ball dive comp stood no chance against it on the first point, not being able to wrestle control from the Shock until they were already at 99%. And Shock easily retook and capped the first point. And moving on to the second point, Fusion came out with an Orisa Diva comp, and while Carpe on the McCree got the first pick, Shock had the speed boost from Lucio and just kited Fusion around, actually winning out the first fight and taking the point first. Fusion looked a lot better in this map, but with Nero's Death Blossom and a nice aggressive defense, Fusion were just left out of the point, and that means they got sent back home. So moving forward, the Shock looked good, but shaky at times. Poor investment of ults is still a problem, and compositional issues arise from them, especially when they have both off-support players, Violet and Twilight, in on the roster. Even though I know Violet can play pretty much everything, he's definitely not as good of a main support as the specialist FD god. There is a lot of good, and with DPS, Neros, and Glister getting going, they are strong. As for the Fusion, Carpe is the brightest spot on this team, carrying the Fusion so much, but the other DPS, Shockwave and EQO, excluding Rascal because we didn't really see him this match and can't really say anything about him, but Shockwave and EQO are super inconsistent. Shockwave when he's not on his comfort hit scans, and EQO, well, pretty much all the time. EQO has never really been a player that I've been big on. He's good and can dominate at times, but he's just so inconsistent that it's not really worth it in my eyes. But with that said, this is the end for the Fusion for the season, while the Shock move on in the losers bracket. And finally, the Washington Justice took on the Atlanta Reign. Atlanta were dominant, so I predicted Atlanta would win this matchup, but that was the Justice would be able to get a map, giving the Reign a 3-1 win. But Washington never stood a chance, losing 3-0 to Atlanta, and since this was played before the Shock Fusion game, becoming the first team out of the tournament. This game started off on Nepal, and both teams went headfirst playing the Rhine Rush mirror. In fact, apart from one point, that was all that was played. And for good reason, as both of these teams have looked their best on the Rhine comp. For Nepal, despite Atlanta winning this map 2-0, it was relatively back and forth, definitely the closest map all series, and a lot of that was due to both the Reinhardts, Mag, and Gator. Gator getting some good shatters, and Mag actually canceling a Blizzard from Pelican with a shatter. Atlanta still took the first map, and things went downhill for the Justice from here. The Justice decided to take Atlanta to Anubis, and on Atlanta's attack, Assassin was not having a good time on May, losing ults and just getting bullied. Oh, and Decay did play the McCree briefly on point A defense, but played the Sim the rest of the time, which I was glad to see. Sim just does better in this type of comp, and while I know Decay would rather play the McCree, things probably would have been a lot worse for Washington if that was possible. So Atlanta was able to take A quickly with a nice fake teleport, and get B fairly easily with plenty of time left. And when Justice attacked, they tried the same sort of fake TP. Atlanta just pushed them, punished them, and had a great defense. I mean, Pelican tried to go for a sneaky Blizzard that got ate by Fury, by the way. But even though Pelican was out of position, Atlanta was still able to clean up the fight and ended up full holding the Justice on A. So last we went to King's Row, where the Justice didn't have much of a defense until the end of B, and that was only temporary while Atlanta had a great A defense, and while the Justice were able to get through most of B fairly easily, Atlanta was able to hold at the end of B with great ult usage and eventually held the Justice to win the series. So what went wrong for Washington? Well, two things. Outside of Atlanta looking really strong, which I'll get to in a moment. First, Decay was quiet. Symmetra is not really the easiest character to shine on, and most of Decay's kills were cleanups, and apart from some good plays on Nepal, probably why that map was decently close, it never really felt like the Decay's name was coming up unless he was getting picked first, which puts more pressure on Assassin playing the Mei to do damage, and this was not his best game. 3 Blizzards cancelled in the match, including 2 cancelled as he died casting the ult, and 1 eaten by Hawk's Diva. Assassin had moments of good, but it just felt like he and the rest of the Justice were trying to force things that were not going to work, and ultimately got punished for it. Atlanta, on the other hand, looked fantastic. Great teamwork all around, especially from Gator and Pelican, getting some nice shatters, Blizzards, and Pelican in general showed why he's the Rookie of the Year, playing Mei and getting so much value just out of his walls to separate players and get picks. Atlanta is looking strong at this point, but this was the end for Washington. Now back up to the top bracket for the winners semifinals, we have the Shanghai Dragons going up against the LA Gladiators and the Chungdu Hunters taking on the Dallas Fuel. First up, we have the Shanghai Dragons versus the Los Angeles Gladiators. Now, this was the first match I got completely wrong in my predictions, as I had hoped that the Gladiators would be peaking at this point, while Shanghai had seemed to be fizzling out, mostly due to the Countdown Cup. Even still, I did predict that this would be a close match, going the Gladiators' way 3-2, but I was wrong. Shanghai handled the Gladiators well and won 3-1 to move on to the winners' finals. Starting off on Control, we went to Ilios, and this was the only close match of the series, and as some of a surprise to me, the Gladiators ran the ball dive comp that Shanghai had made look so good in the past weeks. Or at least they did for the first point, switching to an Orisa-style comp for the second. And Gladiators were able to hang with the Dragons, but Shanghai just had so much talent on this team that the Gladiators couldn't hang around very long. I mean, Lip got 4 EMPs on the first point alone, and while most of those kind of sucked, I think he may have gotten like 4 players total, it still is impressive how quickly Lip can build that ult. Shanghai ended up taking the first map, and the rest of the matches were not so close at all. Full holds on the rest of the series, starting with Hanamura, where Gladiators looked fantastic on A, but fizzled out on B and did manage to cap the point, but it took a while. Shanghai always had another ult or 3 to throw at the Gladiators, and they just couldn't get a good fight until near the end. But it didn't matter because on defense, the Gladiators looked amazing, getting the picks needed to prevent Shanghai from getting more than one tick and winning Hanamura. Next was New Bonnie, a quick map, as was the final map Havana, as Gladiators were not able to get a single cap on either map. On New Bonnie, Lip on the Ash was doing so much and the Gladiators could never get to the high ground to contest Shanghai and just kind of spent the entire round doing nothing. On Havana, Gladiators went for a double shield style, and a fantastic recontest from Shanghai at the end of A halted all progress, and the Gladiators looked desperate, throwing everything into the fights and getting nothing for it. Shanghai had no trouble winning the last 2 maps and the series. But things didn't look bad for the Gladiators. Yes, they had a lot of trouble with Shanghai, but both Kevster and Birdring played fantastic, and Space looked great with his aggressive style of off-tank. The Gladiators were just outmatched by a Shanghai team that worked so well together. Honestly, I think that's one of the Shanghai's biggest strengths, their coordination. But Shanghai, and specifically Lip, need to get better about their ult usage. But with that, Shanghai move on and LA drops down to the losers bracket. And the last match in the semifinals was the Chungdu Hunters versus the Dallas Fuel. Now, this game, I predicted it would be a lot closer than it was. Chungdu is one of the hardest teams to predict, and a huge reason is that nobody understands what they are thinking half the time. I'll get back to that in a minute. So, this game I had Dallas going and winning, and in the end, the Fuel did win. But while I predicted a nail-biter 3-2, Dallas coasted their way to the winner's final 3-0. And when I say coasted, I really mean it. Chungdu was completely dominated, and I think a lot of it comes down to the roster changes that this team decided on for unknown reasons, and the comp choices that just didn't make any sense against a team not known to have a hit scan player. I mean, Jinmu is a very good Pharah, and they like to force that against teams with good hit scan players, like Atlanta, but Jinmu did not play Pharah once against Dallas, who usually have to rely on Sparkle to play Soldier for any type of hit scan. Plus, Chungdu had a good showing against Atlanta playing Nisha and Faraway as their backline, with Gaga on the tank, but came out against Dallas on Control at Lijiang, playing Amang on main tank and Yevdal and Monk on support. Dallas, and specifically Doha on the Sombra, showed in this first map that the ball comps were in danger, as Amang never got to play, getting hacked and deleted immediately, and Dallas never had much issues during Lijiang playing the odd zombie comp with the typical Moria Lucio backline, the normal Sombra Reaper DPS, but playing a ball instead of Winston with the Diva on tank. It worked though, so who cares? For the next match, Hunters brought Gaga back in on main tank, but kept Yevdal and Monk for support, and Volskaya was probably the closest map of this match, with Dallas taking A quickly, playing the ball zombie comp, as I'm going to call it from here on out, and Chungdu putting up a little defense for B, but still a very quick cap for Dallas. I never said that Chungdu did great on this map, just better. Offense was better though, and after Chungdu was able to eventually get the picks needed to cap A, the Hunters snowballed into B and were able to get the full cap with time, leading us to time bank rounds. Chungdu up first, and they tried to play a double bubble comp, and it got them to the point, allowing Chungdu to get almost the cap before Dallas recontested, but then the problems began for the Hunters. A terrible grab from Late Young, as he was the last player on the point and died immediately after using the ult, and then the Hunters were just able to get back into touch the point for overtime, but C9'd after most of Dallas jumped back into the Hunters' backline. Dallas come back out and capped the point with relative ease, winning the map. Finally, going to Eichenwald, the Hunters brought out the roster they used against Atlanta, switching the supports to Nisha and Farway, and keeping Gaga in the game. Chungdu had a decent defense, getting rid of most of Dallas's time bank, although Dallas was able to complete the map with half a second remaining. But again, Chungdu came out on attack with the double bubble and did nothing. Okay, well, not nothing, but Chengdu was able to get a couple of picks to remove Dallas from the point, and when they were close to capping A at like 95%, Dallas recontested, cleared the Hunters off the point, and wasted a couple of Chengdu's ult, like another grab from Late Young that I couldn't tell but either got only a Primal Raging Fearless or nothing, and an EMP from Jinmu that might have been a Fat Finger, might have also been a zoning ult, but either way got absolutely nothing. Chungdu was able to try to get back to the point, but when time ran down, no one was able to touch, and Dallas won pretty easily. With this match over, Dallas moves into the winners finals looking strong. Dallas is showing more ball style comps, and we already know that Fearless is a fantastic Reinhardt and Winston, and I like the hybrid comps we're seeing from them. Playing variations of comps other teams are playing to fit more with what the Fuel want to play. Things are looking good for Dallas, but for Chengdu, not so much. Dropping down to the losers bracket, and more importantly, not looking good. It's fine to have substitutions in this game for your roster, but Chengdu needs to decide who is going to play and keep them in. Both support lines and main tanks play the same heroes, the same comps, so figure out who you want and just keep it that way. Switching rosters like Chengdu did in this match just causes disruptions in the team comms and synergies, and you don't need that in the playoffs. But on a player level, Chengdu needs to get better use out of their ults, especially Late Young in this match, and stop using ults to die. There are a few ults you can throw away, but EMP and Grab are not those types of ults. Chengdu needs to turn things around and quickly. The Hunters look like one of the strongest teams going into the playoffs, and after this, they'll be lucky to survive another match. Moving back down to the losers bracket, in the quarterfinals, I guess it'd be, technically, we have the San Francisco Shock going up against the Chengdu Hunters, and the Atlanta Reign up against the Los Angeles Gladiators, with two more teams heading home after this round. First up, we're going to talk about the Shock versus Chengdu. This was the closest match we've seen so far, and probably the closest match in the entire tournament, going to 6 maps when it looked like it'd be over in like 3 or 4. Once again, my predictions were wrong, as I felt that Chengdu would have an easy time dealing with the Shock, winning 3-1, when the Shock had a struggle but still came out on top, narrowly avoiding the reverse sweep, but winning 3-2. Starting off on Control, we went to Lijiang, where Shock started out playing what's kind of their signature comp in this tourney, the Zombie comp, whereas Chengdu came out with a Ball Pharah style, which they've looked good on. And Chengdu actually figured out their roster, going back to the group that worked well in the first round, with Gaga on main tank and Nisha and Farway on support, which I think is the best roster for the Hunters. Anyways, the first point of Lijiang was fairly back and forth, Chengdu really good at targeting Violet on the Moria and the Shock backline in general, but Chengdu not really able to get a clean enough fight until near the end of the point, and then the Shock struggled to regain control, both sides having fights using pretty much every ult they had and getting nothing, but eventually Shock did manage to recap and take this point. The second point was Control Center, and with Jinmu on the Pharah, well, he didn't do too much. The second point was a much more one-sided to the Shock, and they took it 100-0. Next up, Anubis. Chengdu playing a variety of comps on this map to counter the Shock's zombie comp, and Chengdu had a good defense, getting the Shock down to nearly a minute before San Francisco was able to complete. Lots of ults, not getting anything from the Shock, with Choi Oben's Diva Bomb to combo with Glister's EMP, completely whiffing, and Violet getting stunned out of Coalescence from Anisha returning from spawn on Brig. Chengdu decided to play Dive on offense, and it worked incredibly well, Leave doing a ton of work and snowballing B with the threat of Jinmu's EMP keeping Shock back, and the Hunters completed with 3.5 minutes left. Shock's time bank on attack did well on A, but with no time they were held on B with no ticks, leading to a great defense from Shock in the next round as Chungdu was able to get A relatively quickly and have about 2 minutes to take a tick on B, which never happened. It was a crazy final fight and Shock's respawn advantage paid off, leading to a draw. The first of this tournament, and I think it might have been the only one. So on we move to King's Row, and Orisa comps from both sides. On Shock's attack, Chengdu had a decent A defense, but then not really anything after that. Whereas on Chengdu's attack, Shock had next to no A defense, but held B forever, with Glister on the Ashe doing a lot of work. Chengdu managed to finally push the cart through, but in OT, giving Shock a free attack, and after Nisha on the Mercy got picked early, everything just fell apart for Chengdu, and Shock moved on to match point. Then something happened. Leave woke up and put on his carry pants. On both Dorado and Ilios, Leave was doing the work. And to be fair, on Dorado, Jinmu did well on the Sombra, getting great counter EMPs, twin fights on attack. Faraway on the Zen was fantastic, and Gaga on the ball did a lot too. But Chungdu was able to hold Shock before the end of C, and with only a little bit of slowdown on B, the Hunters were able to relatively easily complete the map and start the reverse sweep. On Ilios, back to the ball comp versus the zombie comp, but this time Chungdu was in full control, heavily focusing on the Shock supports and taking both points fairly easily to tie up the series 2-2. And for the final map, we went to Havana, where the Shock's Ryan Rush went up against Chengdu's double shield, and for Shock's attack, Chengdu held A forever, looking great, and then everything fell apart again. No defense from the Hunters on B, and only late-ish on C was Chengdu able to get something of a defense, and they did hold C, but on attack, Chengdu was completely blown out, fully held on A, and giving the win to Shock. So what went wrong for the Chengdu Hunters? Well, they finally fixed their roster issues, but two of the biggest complaints I've had for this team for so long reared their ugly head and put an end to the Hunters. First, much like the Shock, which we'll get to in a bit, the Hunters have an issue using ults. They tend to throw ults away, using big ultimates in lost fights and not getting anything for them, thinking that they may be able to turn things, but it's just a waste. This has been a problem all year and continued into the tourney. And secondly, Jinmu and his comfort picks, something else I've complained about a lot. Jinmu needs to stop playing Genji, and honestly, Chungdu have the wrong plan of action as they tend to build comps around him rather than Leave, who is miles above Jinmu. Not to say that Jinmu isn't good, but it's just that he's so inconsistent to rely on. Leave is a much better option to build a comp around. And the last bit of criticism I have is on Late Young, the off tank. He's definitely a weak point for this team. Gaga on the main tank certainly had off moments, but it's hard to find highlights of Late Young. He's just overly aggressive without really knowing his limits, and Shock punished that, heavily dividing Chengdu backline when Late Young overextends. That is obviously something that can be fixed, but it hurt the Hunters. That being said, Leave continues to show why he is the MVP this year, and I was pleasantly surprised by both Nisha and Faraway, especially Faraway on the Zen. Good support line, no glaring issues there. But we say goodbye to the Hunters this year, and the Shock move on. Now the Shock looked better this match, especially Nero, who I've always been kind of cool on for most of his career. Glister also did well, and I'm always a big fan of Choyabin. But the Shock continued to try to force fights, and like the Hunters, tend to waste ults in lost fights. And poor Ants on the one match he played in this series did not have a fun time, constantly getting dove and sent back to spawn. Violet as well had a rough time, but to be fair, Chungdu was targeting him most of the time. But the Shock move on and try to complete the losers bracket run to the grand finals. And for probably one of the most exciting matches yet, we have the Atlanta Reign going up against the LA Gladiators. Now, seeing how I predicted that the Gladiators would beat Shanghai Dragons, and how that clearly didn't happen, my prediction was completely off, as I thought we'd be seeing the Reign against the Dragons this round, with the Dragons 3-0ing Atlanta. Foreshadowing, maybe, but Atlanta and the Gladiators certainly gave us probably the most all-around closest match in this tournament, going to 5 and the Reign barely besting LA 3-2. Starting off on control like we do, we went to Ilios in the first instance of the Reign's Orisa Diva comp, going up against Gladiators' Bulk Dive, though Gladiators mirrored Atlanta on the second map, which was well, I believe. And this map was pretty much in the Gladiators' hand the entire time. Atlanta struggled in this first map with the Gladiators' aggressiveness, and while Atlanta was able to get some progress on both points, Kevster and Space were doing so much for Gladiators that they pretty easily took map 1. And thus we moved to Hanamura, where Atlanta certainly didn't look good to begin with, going for the Ryan Rush style TP to point, only to fake it and really only fool their teammate Pelican, who took the TP and paid for it. But Atlanta was still able to get the first point quickly and managed to cap both points with over 4.5 minutes left. For Gladiators' attack, things were much harder for them, both sides playing an Orisa comp, and Gladiators really struggling to get progress on A, finally capping with less time than Atlanta had in Time Bank, and again really struggling to overcome the defenses of Atlanta to take B. Only on the back of Shu on the Baptiste was Gladiators able to take the point, but with only about 15 seconds remaining, still enough for another attack, and it was a decent one, TPing to the point after some repositioning and getting Atlanta off the point long enough to get nearly 80% before being held. But with Atlanta having nearly 5.5 minutes to cap A, it didn't look good for LA. And it looked better when Kevster on the far got his ult in less than 30 seconds. It was crazy how fast he built that. But Atlanta struggled TPing to the point directly twice before they changed their strategy, TP'd to the side room, waited for the cooldown, and then TP'd again to the point, and were able to cap it, tying the series up. Next, we went to Kings Row, with Atlanta playing the Orisa Rhine comps and LA playing the ball comps. Atlanta's attack was slow, especially through B, with Space and Birdring for the Gladiators doing a lot of work, but eventually with Pelican getting a lot of picks and Hawk doing work on the off-tank, Atlanta was able to get the cart in OT. For Gladiators, things were difficult on A, but a breeze through B until Atlanta finally had a defense on C. But Birdring playing the Sombra had an EMP that forced Atlanta, and notably Masa on the Lucio with Sound Barrier, to play very passively, and that alone helped the Gladiators push the cart through, but it was under a minute, so Atlanta did get a second attack. And it was a great time-bank attack from Atlanta, getting the cap on A very quickly, like they did in the regular round, and only getting held halfway through B with a nice 2k pulse bomb from Kevster. But even though Gladiators had nearly twice the time bank, they still struggled to take A. LA finally did get to the point and get the cart moving, but Pelican, now playing the Sombra, had an EMP to end things. Unfortunately, he got picked in the first in the next fight, but Atlanta was still had enough ults and clutch picks to clean up the cart and take this map too. So the Gladiators took us to Dorado. This map was probably the least close of all of them. Gladiators continued to play the ball dive comps, and Atlanta matched that on their attack before switching to a zombie comp with a Ryan instead of Winston for defense. A bit strange, and it did not work at all. Atlanta did decent, getting A relatively easy, but getting held hard on B for a long time before the Rain did manage to get the cart near the end of B. But on defense, well, Atlanta didn't have a defense. Pelican was struggling this map against his counterpart Birdring, both playing the Sombra, and apart from a little bit of delay at the start of the map, Atlanta couldn't get anything rolling and never had a defense. Gladiators breezing through this map and taking us to the fifth map, Nepal. And this one was much more Atlanta. Again with the style differences, as Atlanta played the Ryan Rush style versus Gladiators ball comps, but Atlanta was in full control on the first point, taking it to OT before Gladiators were able to flip the point. Kai was especially dangerous on this map, getting a lot of the major picks cleaning up the Gladiators. Gladiators were able to hold the first point for a bit before Atlanta came back in, cleaned up things, and capped the point. But the second point was all Gladiators, a complete flip from the first point, as once again it went to OT before the other team was able to take the point. But the difference this time is that Atlanta was able to hold it, take it to 99-99, and Kai finished off the Gladiators for the last time, as Atlanta won the map and the series. This was a really great series, one of the best in the playoffs, but at the end of we have to say goodbye to the Gladiators, which is a shame, especially for my playoff predictions, was I had them winning. But the Gladiators looked really good this season. Not to say that they don't typically look like one of the top teams, but this year, with the sheer talent of Shu, Kevster, Birdring, and Space, looked like they could challenge to be the best in the league instead of just being top 5. The only thing this team lacked was that clutch potential, relying a little too much on Kevster to pull that weight, but that's not to say Birdring, Shu, especially Shu, or any of the other players couldn't clutch. They just didn't look as unstoppable as some of the other teams this year in that regard. Still, strong finish to a great season. But Atlanta, on the other hand, moves on and continues to silence the Dollars with their talent, especially the DPS duo of Kai and Pelican, who are without question terrifyingly good. For the winners final, we saw the Dallas Fuel take on the Shanghai Dragons in a game I expected being the Gladiators versus the Fuel, but either way this had the potential to be a good close game of some of the top contenders. But Shanghai proved me wrong in a multitude of ways. Still, I correctly predicted that Dallas would lose this match 3-1, but instead of losing to the Gladiators as in my prediction, Shanghai was the victor in this match. And starting off on control at Ilios, it looked like this was going to be an interesting but close-ish series. Dallas came out playing the unique zombie comp with Ball instead of Winston as is normal, and Shanghai came out with the comp they made strong, the ball dive. And the first point wasn't really that close, with the point going to Shanghai, but was definitely scrappy with a lot of back and forth fights. However, the second point with Shanghai playing the Far Mercy ball comp, and Dallas playing the dive comp with Echo, things were definitely a lot closer. But honestly, once Fleta switched back to the Tracer, which is what I'd call his signature hero, but let's be honest, anything Fleta plays is good enough to be a signature hero. But once Fleta got on Tracer, Dallas had a lot of trouble and Shanghai took the first map. Fleta causing Dallas issues is a reoccurring thing in the series, and a huge reason Shanghai won with relative ease. Anyways, on to Dallas's map pick, Volskaya, and this time we saw a mirror comp of the ball dive for Shanghai's attack. And Dallas was ready with this map, as Shanghai struggled to get to the point and clean up Dallas, only able to cap A with about 40 seconds left, and Shanghai was only able to take B in overtime. This attack from Shanghai was really messy. They built ults quickly but used so much in every fight to get so little in return. Lip builds EMP very fast, but only his last EMP stood out, which is what gave Shanghai the point, but one of Lip's first EMPs was also significant as it was a solo EMP onto Sparkle's Tracer. That's something we'll talk about a little bit more later, as Lip's EMPs are incredibly hit or miss. But for Dallas's attack, they again went with his ball zombie comp, and despite losing Doha on the Sombra early in the first fight, Dallas got Shanghai into a small room and cleaned them up to take A quickly. And then Dallas took forever setting up on B, before finally getting a good counter EMP to Lip's early EMP outside the choke, and Dallas were able to get onto the point, deal with the respawns, and cap with more than 2 minutes left to get a free attack, which was not as good as their first attempt on A, but after a quick reset, Dallas was able to come back in and win this map. So far, still looking competitive in this series, and honestly that didn't change for the next map, Nubani, which both sides were playing variations of dive. And on Dallas's attack, the Fuel managed to cap A quickly before being hard stuck on B, which included a few misplays, one in particular from Fielder accidentally hitting Sparkle's Tracer with the Nano instead of Fearless's Winston, but in the next fight, Sparkle stood out and got the picks needed to get Dallas through B, only to be ultimately held near the end of C. Some bad ults near the end of the attack from Doha on the Sombra, and a poor Nano Monkey from Fearless who just wasn't allowed to play the game. Shanghai's attack was pretty similar, a very quick A take from the Dragons with good bionades from Izyaki's Ana, but Dallas getting a great defense on B to nearly hold Shanghai. Seriously, Dallas stalled Shanghai out on B for nearly 5 minutes. But the difference is that Dallas was not able to get a C defense going, and Shanghai capped, winning this map and taking us to the final map, Dorado. This map was not close. Dallas looked lost, unsure of how to handle things, and a lot of that was due to Shanghai being so aggressive. Shanghai managed to finish the map with nearly 3 minutes left, and a lot of the delay was not because Dallas had any type of defense at all, but because Shanghai was usually only having 1 or 2 players pushing the cart. For Dallas's attack, things were a little bit better, as a few were able to get through A decently quickly, getting reset only 2 or 3 times, but Shanghai was able to hold at the end of B for so long. Dallas just could not get fights to go their way on this map. Every time Dallas got a pick, Shanghai would get 2 and clean up the rest of the fight. Or Dallas would get a couple of picks and not get the one player that had ult to delay long enough to get respawns or to just win the fight out altogether. Dallas looked bad in this last map, but most of it was Shanghai just being that good. And so, Dallas falls to loser's bracket. Not looking all that bad, but definitely struggling in terms of comp choices. Dallas really doesn't know how to handle the ball dive, and I think that their best bet would be the mirror, but they keep trying different things and it's just not working. The ball zombie comp was not a terrible idea, but Fearless is a good Winston and he just needs to fully commit to the comp instead of trying to make the Dallas Fuel variation work. But this is still a strong team and they'll be in the losers finals looking for a chance to get a rematch against the Dragons. As for the Dragons, oh boy do they still look strong. The big weakness is still Lip and his EMP decisions. Sometimes the solo EMP is good, but there are so many wasted EMPs just because of no follow-up or just a bad solo target. But still, Lip builds the EMPs so quickly that it's not usually a big deal. But Fleta and Izzyaki are still some of the most dangerous players in the lobby, so it's hard to imagine any of the remaining teams taking down the Dragons as they move on to the Grand Finals. The final 4 teams are now required to go down to a final 3, as the San Francisco Shock took on the Atlanta Reign for a chance to take down the Dallas Fuel in the losers finals. Now again, my predictions were pretty awful here, expecting to see the Chungdu Hunters and the Shanghai Dragons in this match, but instead we have the Shock and the Reign. And for the record, I had the Dragons winning against the Hunters 3-1. This game between San Fran and Atlanta, however, started out appearing to be a close game, but then fell apart for a 3-1 victory for the Atlanta Reign. Starting off on Control, we went to Nepal, where both teams played the Rhine Rush style with the Symmetra, and this was a mirror we'd seen most of this match, with very little exception. From the get-go, these two teams ran at each other, taking the first point to 99-99, but the Super versus Gator head-to-head was one that appeared to be going in the way of the Shock, as Super was getting the better shatters, and most of Gator's were being blocked. We saw more of this head-to-head on the second point, as Gator on Sanctum decided it'd be fun to pin Super off the point and into the pin not once, but twice. However, Shock looked in control of this map, taking both points after an interesting last fight, where Iris, the BAP of the Reign, had fallen late in the previous fight, causing Masa on the Lucio to go taxi Iris back to the point. But Shock took a really quick fight, attacking the point before the supports for Atlanta were back, giving them the flip and the first map. But that was the only map Shock got. Next up, we went to Hanamura with a small deviation in comp as while both sides ran the Ryan Rush, Atlanta played the Sigma instead of the Diva. Starting off, we saw a really nice play in which Atlanta baited an aggressive defense from Shock onto the Lonely Hawk on Sigma, who then dropped from the high ground to rejoin the rest of the Rain and punish the Shock. This gave the Rain point A quickly, but a really nice stall from Shock, which looked like they might have turned the fight, and Shock was able to get the 6 minutes Atlanta had for B down to less than a minute. Again, the comp changes for Shock's attack as Atlanta moved to a double shield style against Shock's zombie comp, and the Shock struggled on A, taking so long to get anything done and a fight just to go their way, despite getting a tick in the second fight. Still, Shock were able to cap A nearly in overtime before the Shock switched back to the Ryan Rush for B, which worked better. But still, the Shock were only able to cap in OT. Still, due to the great delay on Atlanta's attack, Shock were given another chance, and this time they stuck with the Ryan Rush, getting under the point and nearly capping before being cleared off and the round completed, leading to Atlanta returning on the Ryan Rush mirror, with the exception of the Sigma again, and Rain were able to take this point and the map, leading us to King's Row and more Ryan Rush. But this is where the entire series changed. At the very beginning of Atlanta's attack, Kai on the Widow did the typical shot in the dark to get a pick to start the map. But this time, it worked. And what a target to get, hitting and killing Violet's Baptiste, giving Atlanta a chance to take position onto the point and cap both A and B with relative ease. Seriously, after that one pick, Shock fell apart, not getting a single pick onto an Atlanta player until a little into point C. Atlanta eventually finished, and while Shock had nearly as good of an attack as Atlanta, the difference is that Atlanta did not want to contest last second, and instead held the choke at the start of B. And it took the Shock about 3 minutes to get through that choke and make their way to the end of B, but Atlanta held strong and won this map as well. On to the last map of the series, Havana. With Ryan Rush mirror still, Atlanta again had little trouble getting through A, with a little bit of a C9-ish play from Shock, as Choyobin went for the self-destruct as Diva on the point, but as he was the only one contesting it at the end of A, and his self-destruct ejection sent him a little too high in the air, Atlanta was able to sneak the payload in before Choi landed. Shock only won like 2 team fights for defense, but delayed the cart decently well. Still, Atlanta was able to fully cap. Shock's attack started really well, getting through both A and B without any trouble and having about 4 minutes left to cap C, but then Atlanta started getting a defense going, essentially spawn camping Shock for about a minute and a half, and then holding at the end of the point with some good ultimate cheap fights. Eventually, Atlanta was able to hold and prevent Shock from completing the map, taking the match point and moving on to the losers finals. With the Shock going home, their 3P at the championship will obviously never be. This team had a lot of talent, and I want to especially praise Choyobin in the off-tank, usually on Diva, who have said it in the past is someone I consider to be one of the best off-tanks in the league. He's been quiet at times, but in this game he ate 3, by my count, of Pelicans Blizzards, which is pretty good. I don't think that he's necessarily still the best off-tank currently, but he certainly makes a run for the top. But the Shock just were never able to finish things this season. In previous matches, I've criticized their ult usage, but that looked for the most part better in this match. But whatever it was missing out on the tournaments each month or just barely losing a match, Shock had the talent to take on the other top teams. It just never clicked at the right time. In this match, I think that King's Row was the end for the Shock. With that many teamfight losses, it's hard to keep emotions and mentals in check, and this is a team with players that really struggle with that, keeping cool and collected. Half this team is very emotional in that sense, and it clearly affects this talented squad. But Atlanta, on the other hand, continues to shine. Hawk and Iris in this map doing a lot of work, and there's also a lot of talent for the Rain players. Atlanta is a team that likes to play with a chip on their shoulder, and that can make for a difficult opponent, as the Dallas Fuel will find out next. Because moving on, we head into the losers finals to determine which team, the Dallas Fuel or the Atlanta Rain, will get a chance to take down the Shanghai Dragons in the grand finals. And this game was pretty fun to watch, starting out with both teams playing a lot of Ryan Rush style, which both teams are good at, and then moving on to more dive style gameplay, leading to an interesting match. Now, of course, my predictions were completely wrong, as I thought Dallas would be playing Shanghai at this point and losing in a close match 3-2. And I did get Dallas losing correct, but Atlanta defeated the Fuel in a bit more of a decisive manner, Atlanta winning this match 3-1. Starting off on Control, we went to Lijiang, where the Ryan Rush style was very much in favor of Dallas, at least for the first point, which went 100-0. The rest of the map was a lot closer, with the next point going the way of Atlanta, and Dallas taking the last point in OT. This map was very much down to the main tanks Fearless and Gator, and Fearless really liked going for the TP Shatters, which worked more than I expected them to. Hanbin also ate the first blizzard of the match from Pelican, and all in all, Dallas liked going to the Doom Sim comp in the Rhine Rush mirror, and it works well when Atlanta is playing the typical Sim Mei. I mean, Sparkle is arguably the best Doomfist in the league, so that might have something to do with it. But Dallas went Li Jiang, and Atlanta took us to Hanamura. Of course. Hanamura has looked like one of Atlanta's best map recently, and the Reign love playing the Orisa comps here, with the Echo in the sky. But on defense, Atlanta struggled on A against Dallas' zombie-style comp, with a hack onto Moss's Mercy from Doha, giving Dallas A so quickly. But then Atlanta dug in their heels, and Dallas got pretty much nothing for the rest of their attack, despite comp switches and everything. Dallas only got about 45% on B. And so Atlanta's attack was rematch of the Rhine Rush comps, and again, Dallas looked like the better team in that matchup, nearly holding Atlanta to a single tick on A, before a good set of ults from Atlanta gave them the capture on A, the snowball into B, and the map. Now, on to the next map, we head to King's Row, and as a bit of a surprise, Rhine Rush was not played here. Well, okay, at least not the mirror until the Tom Binks, but we'll get there. On offense, Atlanta started out on the Orisa Diva while Dallas was playing the ball dive. Yes, Dallas was playing the ball over the Winston, and Dallas had a decent defense, holding well on both the end of B and all of C, and getting Atlanta down to less than a minute with the full cap. For their offense, Dallas played the double bubble against Atlanta's Rhine Rush, and another quick A take. Atlanta was able to hold Dallas off the choke on B, had a much better B defense, but eventually Dallas did cap with 10 seconds less than Atlanta had, going to time bank and back to the Rhine mirror. Sorta. See, while the tanks and the supports were mirrored, the DPS were not for Dallas' attack, as Atlanta played the Torb and McCree, which worked well despite a decent TP pincer attack, and Dallas ended this round with no progress. But Atlanta's attack was not super clean, although Doha did not have a good time getting picked early on May, switching to Doom to get back and again getting picked immediately. But despite another Blizzard eat from Hanbin, Atlanta was able to cap the point and get to the match point. And off to Dorado we went, surprisingly for these teams that like the Rhine Rush, and it was Atlanta's ball dive against Dallas's classic Winston dive. Atlanta attacked first again, and this attack was so back and forth the entire time. Dallas never got Atlanta completely stopped, but Atlanta wasn't just cruising through the map either. Lots of fights started with one team getting the other supports, only for the counter dive to get more and win the fight. But Atlanta did have a little help from Dallas, C9ing on B, and eventually Atlanta was able to push the cart through in OT. For attack, Dallas continued with the Winston dive against Atlanta's ball dive. Atlanta had about as much defense as Dallas did on A, so that was taken quickly, but Atlanta held B for much longer. Dallas has a bad habit in this map of pushing aggressively after a fight, as most teams do, but much further than most of the league. And then Pelican would just go contest the cart as Sombra, usually take out the person on the cart, and force Dallas to retreat back. There was also a big difference between the Sombra plays of Pelican and Doha, as Doha liked to solo ult Gator on the ball, while Pelican usually used EMP more defensively to stop the aggression from Dallas. And Atlanta was able to just get the picks needed to win fights, ultimately stopping Dallas at the end of C and winning the match. So with that, Dallas is our third place team, and Atlanta gets a chance to take down the Dragons in the grand finals. And honestly, it's a bit surprising that Atlanta would be the team moving on, but Dallas and Atlanta have had such a great rivalry this year, and Dallas has been so impressive with no dedicated hit scans player, and Sparkle and Doha having to be creative to deal with all of the different comps we've seen. Dallas deserves to be in the top of the league this year with the talented roster they have, and Atlanta is the surprising team that just scrapes by. Atlanta is one of the toughest looking teams in the league, not just because of their all-star roster, which is great, don't get me wrong, but not as stacked as some other teams. But Atlanta just works so well as a team that it's hard to exploit any weaknesses. But now, that's Shanghai's job as we head to the grand finals of the Overwatch League 2021 season. That's right, the final match of the season, and presumably the final Overwatch 1 match ever in the league. The Shanghai Dragons with their star-studded roster against the Atlanta Reign, the underdog and one of the most underrated teams in the league. Now, first things first, I originally predicted that the Shanghai Dragons would be going up against the LA Gladiators. I was wrong, and even more wrong as I predicted that the Gladiators would beat Shanghai 4-3. In reality, Atlanta looked like the second strongest team in the playoffs, and, well, they were swept. Shanghai Dragons won the grand finals 4-0. So let's start off on control at Ilios. Shanghai played mostly their signature ball dive throughout this match, and on Ilios, ball dive is what the Dragons relied on. Atlanta, on the other hand, started with their signature Ryan Rush before moving over to a ball dive hybrid comp of their own with the zombie comp supports, that is, Morio and Lucio. And honestly, the first point with Atlanta playing the Ryan Rush was no competition. The Dragons are so dangerous with the ball dive, and Atlanta never really stood a chance. The second point was a bit closer, with Atlanta able to get up to about 65%, but Shanghai just kept winning lopsided fights, and Atlanta could never get a fight win cleanly enough to hold. Shanghai won on Ilios, and we moved to Hanamura, one of Atlanta's best maps. And it was here that we started to see some variations. Atlanta on attack was playing the ball dive, while Shanghai played the double shield with Fleta in the air as Farah. We also got to see a cheeky little play as Izayaki on the Ana hid in the ramen shop and got asleep on Pelican's May to get a quick pick at the very start of the map. But Atlanta struggled on A, eventually switching to an Orisa of their own, and did manage to cap A in overtime and snowball into B with about a minute and a half left. For Shanghai's attack, the team comp swapped, and Atlanta going the double shield, and Shanghai on the ball dive. But Shanghai had a much easier time on A, getting 2 ticks on the back of a pick onto Moss's Mercy, and eventually taking A. Atlanta looked a lot better on B, switching to more of a Rhine comp as Shanghai switched to the double shield comp, and just like on A, Atlanta again gave up 2 ticks before recontesting and holding for a bit longer on B. But Shanghai eventually capped and had a fairly similar time bank as Atlanta, and the time bank rounds were a lot different. For Atlanta's attack, Fleta was again in the air as Farah, and with a nice bio-nade onto the Ryan Rush comp of Atlanta, including the Symmetra and her teleport, Fleta basically had Barrage in one fight, and Atlanta was unable to get any ticks. And then surprisingly, for Shanghai's attack, they went the Ryan Rush against Atlanta's double shield with the Tord for the anti-dive. And on the back of a fake TP, Shanghai was able to get the first tick and win Hanamura. The next map was King's Row, and Shanghai attacked first, playing the Ball Sigma comp against Atlanta's Rhine comp, Atlanta having a bit of a defense on A. And that's it. Shanghai was in complete control of this map and just blew Atlanta out of the water, having basically no trouble getting all 3 points and capping with little over 3 minutes left. Atlanta, on the other hand, had a bit of trouble getting through King's Row. Playing the double shield against Shanghai's Ball Sigma comp, Atlanta was always going to take more time just with the slower comp, but was still able to cap A fairly easily, forcing Shanghai onto the double shield. That's when Lip started carrying. Lip on the Hanzo was getting so many early picks, Atlanta's offense was just slow to a crawl. But Atlanta, on the back of a lot of ult and getting decent trades, like Fate's Orisa pushed Shanghai back, and the Reign were able to cap B before being stopped again at the start of C. Finally, though, Atlanta was able to cap C off with a nice flux from Hawk Sigma, and finish the map with about a minute and a half left. For Atlanta's time bank, this time we started with the double shield mirror, and Atlanta did quite well despite the lowest time bank, getting a nice pick early on Lip and using the overtime spawns to get through both A and B before being held at the start of C. The heavy use of ults worked great for Atlanta on B, but Shanghai just did the same thing at the start of C to get the hold. Moving on to Shanghai's time bank attack, this time back to the ball dive for Shanghai while Atlanta stayed on the double shield. Shanghai again didn't have any problem getting through the Atlanta defense and easily capped A, B, and the little distance of C. So 3-0 now, and we move to Havana. Atlanta attacking first and still with the Atlanta double shield up against the Shanghai ball dive. Starting out, Kai on the Hanzo got a nice pick onto Izayaki Zen, and Atlanta were able to get a good push through A, but then the recontest from Shanghai halted everything. Atlanta had a lot of trouble getting the cap on A, using a ton of ults and just not getting enough, but Hawk again shined for the Reign, helping to get the picks needed to cap A. And through B, Atlanta actually managed pretty well, dealing with a ton of ults from Shanghai without losing the fight or using much of anything in response, and Atlanta was able to cap B with mostly just a bit of delay from Shanghai, prompting the Dragons to switch to double shield. And again, Lip popped off, this time on Widow, and Shanghai was just really good at getting around Atlanta's shields and eventually held Atlanta halfway through C. For Shanghai's attack, Shanghai did the unthinkable. Fate played Winston. We haven't seen that for a long time. So with Shanghai on double bubble and Atlanta playing the Rhine Rush, of course Atlanta goes for the spawn camp, which didn't last too long. And while Atlanta did get a couple of nice picks in the next fight, Shanghai was able to use the ults to turn the fight and nearly cap A, but Atlanta had both support ults and were able to drive Shanghai back. Time for the Cinderella story, right? Well, no, as Shanghai came back in and took A ultless, and again, Lip was dominating playing Hanzo, and with Void on the Zarya, Shanghai was able to take B fairly quickly, but then the C defense. Atlanta got a fight win, and when you thought you saw it all, fate switched to Rhine, which to be honest isn't too surprising, but Shanghai did not run ball dive at all for their offense. Still, Fleta on the Tracer got the cleanup and fight win that Shanghai needed, getting a 2K with a pulse bomb, and Shanghai were able to cap and win the series to become the 2021 champions. So that was it. Despite being a 4-0, Atlanta didn't look bad. Seeing a scoreline like that, it's easy to think that, well, maybe Atlanta didn't belong. But that was not the case at all. Shanghai just played on a completely different level. Hawk looked fantastic all map, Pelican and Kai did great, and when Gator wasn't playing Rhine, he looked good too. And that's not to say that Gator doesn't have a good Rhine or anything, it's just when you're playing up against a Tracer like Fleta and a Sombra like Lip, Rhine's just not going to have fun. And the Atlanta supports looked good too, don't get me wrong. I truly believe that Atlanta has the right to say that they were the second best team. Even if you pick a different day, they might lose to half the teams in the playoffs, but the competition up at the top was close. Atlanta looked good, taking a lot of the maps to 5 or 6 points, but the Dragons were unstoppable. I talked a lot about Lip, but he was insane during this match. Fleta was also good, and Izayaki and Voy were top-notch too. There's so much talent on this team, and I know people have criticized Fate at the main tank, but he played at the next level too. This Dragons roster is so stacked, I'm not entirely sure why I had doubts they'd win. To be fair, I expected less from Atlanta due to Pelican's situation, and most of the teams in the top 8 could probably beat every other team, but still, this Dragons team wanted it. Now, a lot of people like to make comparisons to the Season 1 Dragons 0-40 record, but I'm going to leave things off with this. They aren't the same teams. The franchise doesn't matter when it comes to the best roster. Look no further than Vancouver for that, or Florida for that matter. If there was considerable similarities in the rosters from 2 different seasons, fine, make the comparisons. But when there's not, it's basically 2 different teams, and it's disrespectful in my opinion to imply that the comparison between the 2 rosters is a change in skill or coaching, and not a personnel change. Something that bugs me. Celebrate this Dragons team, not because of the past, but because of the pure unstoppable talent this roster had. So the Dragons reigned supreme this season, taking home the championship and doing so in a fairly dominant fashion, at least for this season. It will be interesting to see what the future holds for all of these teams, as a lot is going to change in the Overwatch League from here on out, but who knows. For now, we are celebrating the Dragons, and as for me, I've got a lot of work to do finishing up the videos I want for this 2021 season. So with that, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and look forward to the next videos finishing up the rest of the regular season, and one last video to tie everything up. So until then, I will see you in the next video. Bye!